Sarah Martinez sat motionless in the dim corner of Angelo's diner, her calloused hands wrapped tightly around a cup of cold coffee. Her eyes were heavy with exhaustion. 3 weeks of double shifts, serving tables from dawn until midnight, just to keep a small roof over her and Emily, her 8-year-old daughter. Rent was due. Bills were piling up. And now Elena, the only grandmother she had left, was lying on her deathbed in Paris. The cruelest part? She didn't have the money to get to her. When Aunt Marie's call came, Sarah nearly collapsed. "The doctors, they said we should prepare ourselves." Marie's voice broke over the line. A plane ticket, bought out of love, a single chance to say goodbye. She couldn't hesitate. But leaving Emily? Facing a past she had spent years running from? Sarah took a slow, shaky breath. This journey would change everything. Will Sarah make it to Paris in time? And who will change her life on the flight that awaits her? Follow this emotional journey to find out. The diner smelled of burnt coffee and grilled cheese, the scent clinging to Grace Turner's uniform like a second skin. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a dull glow on the few late-night customers nursing their meals. She wiped down a table, muscles aching, exhaustion settling deep in her bones. 3 weeks of double shifts, 3 weeks of barely making ends meet. The tip jar at the counter mocked her, crumpled dollar bills and a few quarters. Not enough. Never enough. Her phone buzzed in her apron pocket. A glance at the screen sent a chill through her. Aunt Carol. She hesitated, then answered. "Grace, it's your grandmother. It's bad." The world tilted. "The doctors. They said we should prepare ourselves. You need to come now." Her breath hitched. She gripped the counter to steady herself. "I can't afford a ticket," she whispered. "I already bought one. You leave in the morning." Tears burned behind her eyes. She wanted to say no, to tell Carol she couldn't just leave everything behind, not her job, not her daughter. But how could she refuse? She hadn't seen Grandma Louise in years, hadn't been able to. Life had swallowed her whole after Ryan walked out, leaving her to pick up the pieces. And now she might not have another chance. The next morning, Lily clung to her at the front door, small hands gripping Grace's worn denim jacket. "Mommy, why can't I come with you?" Grace knelt, smoothing back her daughter's chestnut curls. "Because school's important, baby, and I'll only be gone a few days." Lily's lower lip trembled. 8 years old, too young to understand, but old enough to know when something felt wrong. "I don't want you to go. I'll call you every day, I promise." Grace pressed a kiss to Lily's forehead, breathing in the scent of strawberry shampoo. Behind them, Ryan Carter stood in the doorway, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "You sure you can handle this?" Grace asked. "I'll take care of her," Ryan said stiffly. He was always like this, cool, controlled, calculating. A lawyer who knew exactly how to wield words like weapons. She knew that look in his eyes, the same one he had during their custody hearings. "Don't do anything reckless, Grace." She stiffened. "Reckless?" Ryan leaned against the doorframe, his voice smooth but laced with quiet threat. "I'm just saying, the courts like stability. A mother who abandons her kid for some last-minute trip? That doesn't look great." Her fingers curled into fists. "She's my daughter, Ryan, and I expect you to act like it." The rage boiled under her skin, but she forced herself to stay calm. He wanted a reaction. He wanted a reason to use this against her. She turned back to Lily, forcing a smile. "I love you, sweetheart. Be good for Daddy, okay?" Lily nodded reluctantly. Grace stood, grabbed her bag, and walked away. She didn't give Ryan the satisfaction of looking back. Dallas-Fort Worth Airport was a blur of security lines and hurried steps. Grace clutched her boarding pass, breathless as she sprinted toward the gate. Just as the final boarding call rang out. "Wait, please," she called, waving her ticket. The gate agent sighed but scanned it anyway. "You're in 14C. Hurry along." She rushed down the jet bridge, heart hammering. Inside the plane, passengers were already settled, the overhead bins nearly full. She dragged her carry-on down the narrow aisle, scanning seat numbers. 14C middle seat? Great. She squeezed past the aisle passenger, muttering apologies, then turned to the man in the window seat, a sharply dressed businessman, nose buried in a leather-bound book. Even seated, he was tall, broad-shouldered, dark hair perfectly styled, a few silver strands at his temples. British, judging by the polished air about him. She struggled to lift her bag into the bin, her arms trembling from exhaustion. Without looking up from his book, he reached up effortlessly, hoisted it into place. "Thank you," she breathed, sliding into her seat. Finally, she allowed herself to exhale. "Long day?" His voice was rich, smooth, like an audiobook narrator. She glanced at him properly now. Green eyes, intelligent but kind. "Long month," she admitted. His lips quirked slightly, but he said nothing more. Fine by her. She wasn't in the mood for small talk. The flight attendants began their safety demonstration, but Grace barely registered the words. She was too tired, her body too heavy, her mind spiraling with worry. The engines roared to life. The plane lifted off, and somewhere between takeoff and exhaustion, her head tilted to the side, landing against something solid, warm, steady. She blinked blearily. Oh, God. She had just fallen asleep on a stranger's shoulder. For a fleeting moment, she considered pulling away, apologizing. But the warmth, the quiet hum of the plane, the sheer weight of her exhaustion held her in place, and he didn't move. He didn't tense, didn't shift away. If anything, he adjusted slightly, making her more comfortable. She barely noticed when a soft weight settled over her shoulders. A jacket. His. Sleep claimed her before she could question it. Nathaniel, Nate Calloway, closed his book, his gaze flickering briefly to the woman now asleep beside him. Her face, peaceful in sleep, was etched with exhaustion. She was beautiful in a quiet, unpolished way. Not the type of woman who usually shared his world of boardrooms and luxury lounges. He should move her, wake her, but he didn't. Instead, he let her rest. When the flight attendant approached with dinner service, he lifted a hand, shaking his head. "Let her sleep," he murmured. The attendant nodded, moving on. Outside, the city lights faded beneath them, lost in the night sky. Nate leaned back against his seat, staring at the woman beside him. He had no idea that this exhausted stranger, this woman who had unknowingly curled into his side, was about to change his life forever. Grace stirred as the hum of the plane engines filled her ears. The warmth wrapped around her shoulders wasn't just from the cabin. It was something softer, heavier. Her eyes fluttered open. A jacket, a man's jacket. Her heart stuttered as she realized her head was resting against something firm. No, someone. She jerked upright, heat rushing to her face as she turned to the man beside her. Nathaniel Calloway. His green eyes met hers, filled with something dangerously close to amusement. "Oh, God," she whispered, tugging the jacket off her shoulders and shoving it toward him. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to." Nate raised a hand, stopping her flustered rambling. "Don't apologize." He took the jacket, folding it neatly over his lap. "You look like you needed it." Grace swallowed, still mortified. I haven't been sleeping much lately." His gaze softened, his British accent smooth and unhurried. That much was obvious. She exhaled shakily, glancing down at her hands. "Still, falling asleep on a stranger? Not exactly my best moment." "Strangers don't usually offer their jackets either," he countered, a faint smile playing on his lips. She huffed out a quiet laugh. "Okay." So he wasn't making this more awkward than it had to be. He watched her for a beat, then tilted his head. "First time flying to L.A.? Grace shook her head. "First time in years. I used to travel more, but life happened." His gaze flickered with curiosity, but he didn't push. "Business or pleasure?" Her lips pressed together. "Neither. Family emergency." A pause, then softer. "I'm sorry to hear that." Grace nodded, glancing at the book in his lap. "What about you? Business, I'm guessing?" Nate leaned back, regarding her with an easy confidence. "That obvious?" She arched a brow, taking in the expensive suit, the understated but clearly expensive watch. "Just a little," he chuckled, the sound low and rich. "I run a financial consulting firm. I spend far too much time on planes between New York and Los Angeles." "Sounds exhausting." "More than I'd care to admit." She hesitated, then admitted. I used to be a teacher before my divorce. Now I work at a diner in Dallas. Something in his expression shifted. Not pity, not judgment, but something close to admiration. That must be tough, she shrugged. You do what you have to. My daughter, Lily, she's 8, smart, loves to draw. Everything I do is for her. Nate was quiet for a moment, then said, She's lucky to have you. Grace blinked, caught off guard. Most people either looked at her like a sad statistic or avoided the subject entirely. But Nate, he just saw her. She smiled, small but genuine. Thank you. The moment stretched between them, something unspoken settling in the air. Then her stomach growled, loudly. Her eyes widened in horror. Nate smirked. You missed dinner service. Oh my God, she covered her face. Please tell me that didn't just happen. He chuckled, pressing the call button for the flight attendant. You should eat, she groaned. I can't afford anything on this flight. Nate's smirk didn't waver. That's why I ordered for you. The flight attendant appeared moments later with a first-class meal, fresh croissants, fruit, eggs that didn't look like they came from a carton. Grace blinked at the tray as it was placed in front of her. I can't accept this. Nate simply leaned back. Consider it repayment for using my shoulder as a pillow. Her jaw dropped. That's not how repayment works. He shot her an easy grin. It is now. Against her better judgment, Grace laughed. By the time the plane landed at LAX, Grace felt lighter. She wasn't sure if it was the food, the company, or the brief illusion of normalcy that Nate had given her for a few hours. They exited the plane together, but before they could part ways, he hesitated. How are you getting to the hospital? Grace frowned. Uber, I guess. He glanced at his phone. My driver's outside. Let me take you. She opened her mouth to argue, but he cut her off. Grace? His voice was steady, assured in a way that made arguing feel pointless. You need to get there quickly. Let me help. She hesitated, then nodded. Okay. The ride through LA was quiet, the tension in her chest growing heavier the closer they got. When the car finally pulled up to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, Grace turned to Nate. Thank you. For this. For everything. He nodded once. Take care of your grandmother. She barely made it through the hospital doors before Aunt Carol appeared, her face lined with exhaustion. She's weak, Carol whispered, but she's still with us. Relief and panic warred in Grace's chest as she hurried to her grandmother's bedside. Louise Turner looked smaller than she remembered, frail against the white sheets. Grace grasped her hand. Grandma? Louise's eyes fluttered open, a tired smile appearing. You came, my little bird. Tears blurred Grace's vision. Of course I came. Louise's fingers curled around hers. You look troubled. Grace shook her head, not wanting to add more weight to her grandmother's shoulders, but then her phone vibrated. She pulled it out, frowning at the flood of notifications. A dozen missed calls from Ryan. A text. What the hell are you doing? She scrolled further, and then her breath caught. A photo, circulating all over social media. Her, asleep on Nate Calloway's shoulder, his jacket draped over her. The caption? Even billionaires need a travel companion. Who is the mystery woman? Panic clawed up her throat. Her name wasn't in the articles yet, but it wouldn't take long. And when Ryan saw this, really saw this, he'd use it. He'd twist it into something ugly. As if on cue, her phone rang again. She answered on the second ring. Ryan's voice was ice cold. You just made the biggest mistake of your life. Grace's heart pounded. Everything was about to fall apart. The scent of antiseptic and faint traces of old flowers clung to the air as Grace walked through the hospital corridor. The rhythmic beep of monitors and muffled voices from distant rooms made her pulse quicken. Hospitals had always unsettled her. Too many memories of waiting, of helplessness. Her steps faltered as she approached the room. Aunt Carol stood just outside, exhaustion etched deep into the lines of her face. She's weaker than I expected, Carol said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Grace swallowed hard. But she's still fighting? Carol nodded. For now. A tight breath left Grace's lungs as she stepped inside. Louise Turner lay against stark white pillows, looking impossibly small, her silver hair framing a face that had once been so full of life. Her fingers twitched slightly, and her eyelids fluttered open at the sound of Grace's hesitant footsteps. A slow smile spread across her grandmother's face. "You came, my little bird." Tears welled in Grace's eyes. She reached for Louise's hand, feeling the frail, papery skin beneath her fingertips. "Of course I did," she whispered. Louise's fingers curled around hers with surprising strength. "I was waiting for you." A lump formed in Grace's throat. "I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." Louise studied her for a long moment, her eyes sharp despite her weakened state. "You look troubled." Grace forced a smile, shaking her head. "I'm just tired." A knowing look passed over Louise's face. She had always been able to see through Grace. "And the man waiting outside? Should I be asking about him?" Grace blinked, caught off guard. "How did you?" Louise chuckled weakly. "Carol mentioned a very handsome stranger drove you here." Heat crept up Grace's neck. "It's nothing like that. He just helped me." Louise's lips twitched. We'll see." Before Grace could respond, her phone buzzed violently in her pocket. The moment she saw Ryan's name flash across the screen, dread curled in her stomach. She hesitated, then answered. His voice was ice cold. "What the hell are you doing?" Her breath hitched. "Ryan, Oh, don't even try. Do you have any idea how this looks?" Confusion flickered through her. "What are you talking about?" A sharp exhale crackled through the receiver. "Check your phone." Grace pulled the device away from her ear, her stomach plummeting the second she saw the notification banner. A message from one of the servers at the diner. "Holy shit, Grace! You're famous." Her fingers trembled as she clicked the link. And there it was, a photo of her and Nate on the plane. She was fast asleep against his shoulder, his jacket draped over her, the moment framed with the intimacy of something far more personal than it really was. The headline beneath it made her blood run cold. Even billionaires need a travel companion. Who is the mystery woman with Nathaniel Calloway? Her pulse roared in her ears as she scrolled through the article. Speculation, assumptions. They painted her as a mystery lover, a waitress turned gold digger who had somehow caught the attention of one of the wealthiest men in finance. The comments were worse. Typical. Another nobody trying to land a rich man. Doesn't she have a kid? Mother of the year, everyone. Look at her. He's out of her league. A cold wave of nausea swept over her. Ryan's voice cut through the panic. This is exactly the kind of thing that makes people question custody. Her throat tightened. That's not... You think a judge is going to look at this and think Lily belongs with you? His tone was smooth, controlled, dangerous. Because I can promise you, my lawyers are already drafting the argument. She gripped the phone so tightly her knuckles ached. You can't do that. This isn't what it looks like. Ryan gave a low, humorless laugh. It doesn't matter what it is, Grace. It only matters what people believe. Her vision blurred, panic threatening to consume her. She couldn't lose Lily. A shadow passed across the doorway. Nate. He took one look at her, and his entire demeanor shifted. His casual confidence hardened into something sharper, his green eyes scanning her face, taking in the sheer panic written there. She barely registered Ryan still talking in her ear. Fix this, Grace, or I will. The line went dead. Silence hung between her and Nate, heavy and suffocating. Then softly, what happened? She forced a breath through her tight chest. I need to go. Nate studied her for a beat, then gestured toward the hallway. Let's talk outside. She hesitated but followed. Once they were clear of the hospital room, she held up her phone, showing him the article. Your PR team posted this. Nate's brows drew together as he took the phone from her, scanning the article. His jaw clenched. I didn't authorize this. She let out a bitter laugh. Well, it's done now. Nate looked at her, really looked at her, and the steel behind his eyes sent a shiver down her spine. Give me 30 minutes, he said. What? I'll handle it. She shook her head. It's too late. People have already seen it. Then I'll fix the narrative. His words were simple, but there was an unshakable certainty in them, like a man who was used to bending the world to his will. She exhaled sharply, pressing her fingers to her temples. I don't even care about the article. I care about Ryan using this against me. He just threatened to go after custody. A muscle ticked in Nate's jaw. That changed things. His voice was quieter when he spoke again. You shouldn't have to deal with this alone. A lump formed in her throat. Well, I don't exactly have a choice. Something flickered in his expression, something unreadable. Then he handed her phone back. I'll make some calls, he said. Stay with your grandmother. I'll take care of the rest. Grace stared at him. This man, this billionaire she had met less than a day ago, was standing here, offering to protect her from a battle she hadn't even asked to fight. And against all logic, against everything she knew about the world, she believed him. The morning light filtered through the hospital room's blinds, casting long shadows over the sterile white walls. Grace sat in the chair beside her grandmother's bed, fingers curled around a cup of coffee she wasn't drinking. Sleep had evaded her all night, chased away by the wildfire of chaos ignited by a single photograph. Her phone buzzed, rattling against the side table. Ryan. Again. Her stomach twisted as she picked it up, already bracing for the worst. Morning, Grace. His voice came smoothly, too controlled. That meant trouble. She swallowed, forcing her tone to stay even. What do you want? Ryan sighed dramatically. You, apparently, need a reminder of what's at stake. Her grip on the phone tightened. Ryan, don't... Already did. The breath left her lungs. What do you mean? There was a pause, then the unmistakable click of a PDF being sent through. A second later, her phone vibrated with a new email. She opened it, her pulse hammering in her ears. Legal notice of custody modification petition. Her hands trembled as she skimmed the text. Filed by Ryan Carter. Petitioning for full custody of Lily Carter, citing concerns regarding parental fitness. No, she whispered. Oh, yes. Ryan's voice carried a sickening edge of satisfaction. You think judges favor single mothers out of the goodness of their hearts? They favor stability. And right now you don't look very stable, Grace. Her breath hitched. I did a little digging, he continued, casually cruel. The courts are going to love the fact that you've barely kept up with rent in the last 6 months. And that diner paycheck? Not exactly a picture of financial security. She squeezed her eyes shut. Nausea rising. Oh, and then there's the best part, Ryan mused. Your new billionaire boyfriend. Grace's heart pounded. He's not... Ryan chuckled. Save it. You fell asleep on a man's shoulder, and the world thinks you're sleeping with him. That's what matters, Grace. Perception. If the internet already believes it, how do you think a judge will? I hate you. The words were quiet, raw. I don't need you to love me. I just need the judge to believe that I am the better parent. The line went dead. Grace stared blankly at the phone, her entire body numb. Then it rang again. She almost ignored it, but then she saw the name. Nate. She hesitated, then answered. Where are you? His voice was different, low, firm, carrying the kind of authority that didn't need to be raised to be felt. Grace swallowed hard. Hospital. I'm on my way. She blinked. Nate, you don't... I do. The line clicked off. 15 minutes later, he was there. He strode into the hospital waiting area, his presence a stark contrast to the drab walls and worn-out furniture. His suit was perfectly tailored, but his expression was anything but composed. He stopped in front of her, his green eyes sharp, scanning her face like he was reading everything she wasn't saying. What did he do? Grace exhaled shakily. He filed for full custody. A muscle ticked in Nate's jaw. On what grounds? Her throat tightened. He hired someone to dig into my past. My job, my financial situation, the photo. He's twisting all of it. Nate inhaled slowly, his fists clenching at his sides. And you were going to fight this alone? I am alone, Nate, she whispered. Ryan knows the system better than I do. He has money, lawyers, power. Nate's jaw hardened. So do I. Her breath caught. His voice was quiet but unshakable. He wants a war? He just picked the wrong battlefield. She shook her head, overwhelmed. I can't ask you to. You didn't ask. He stepped closer, his voice softer now, but no less certain. I told you, I won't let him destroy your life. Tears burned at the back of her throat. Why? Something flickered in his expression, something deep and unreadable. Because I know what it's like to have someone try to take everything from you. She didn't know what to say. Nate pulled out his phone, dialing with swift precision. It's Calloway, he said when the call connected. I need my legal team assembled in an hour. A pause. No, not corporate. Family law. The best we have. Grace stared at him, stunned. I don't care what it costs, he continued. I want everything they can find on Ryan Carter. If he has so much as an unpaid parking ticket, I want to know about it. Her heart pounded. He hung up and turned back to her. That's step one. She swallowed. Step one? Nate's expression was ice cold. We're going to make sure that when this goes to court, Ryan is the one who looks unfit. For the first time since she got that phone call, she felt something other than terror. Hope. It terrified her. She exhaled. This is my fight, Nate. He nodded. Then let me stand beside you. She didn't know how to say no, because deep down she didn't want to. The courtroom was colder than Grace expected. Not in temperature, but in atmosphere. Sterile, detached, as if her entire life had been reduced to legal arguments and paperwork. The weight of it settled deep in her chest as she took her seat at the defendant's table. Across the aisle, Ryan sat with his team of lawyers, poised and confident, like a man who had already won. The judge, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s, adjusted her glasses as she shuffled through the documents in front of her. We're here today for a preliminary hearing regarding the custody of Lily Carter, age 8, she announced. Petitioner, Mr. Ryan Carter, claims concerns regarding the fitness of the child's mother, Ms. Grace Turner, due to financial instability and questionable personal associations. Grace's fingers curled into fists beneath the table. Questionable personal associations. That was Ryan's polished way of saying the billionaire she sat beside. She felt Nate shift slightly next to her, but he remained silent, his expression unreadable. Ryan's lead attorney stood first, buttoning his suit jacket with the kind of smug confidence that came from years of winning. Your Honor, the facts are simple. My client, Mr. Carter, is a respected attorney, financially stable, and able to provide Lily with a life free of uncertainty. Ms. Turner, on the other hand, has demonstrated financial recklessness and inability to provide a consistent home environment, and, most concerning, a recent involvement in a public scandal with Mr. Nathaniel Calloway. A murmur rippled through the room at the mention of Nate's name. Grace's stomach twisted. Ryan's lawyer continued, his voice even, calculated. Ms. Turner has worked as a waitress for the past 6 years. An honorable profession, certainly, but one that does not provide the financial security required to raise a child. He turned, glancing at Grace as if she were something beneath him. In contrast, Mr. Carter earns a substantial income and resides in a stable home, free of the financial difficulties Ms. Turner faces. The words dug into her like a blade. Then he dropped the hammer. Furthermore, recent photographs of Ms. Turner in an intimate position with Mr. Calloway, a billionaire with no known prior relationship to her, have raised serious concerns regarding her judgment. We are prepared to argue that her focus has shifted away from her daughter and toward personal gain, something we believe should weigh heavily in this court's decision. Ryan sat back, smug as if he had already won. Grace's pulse pounded. Then Nate moved. He rose, his presence commanding, exuding a confidence that made the entire room sit up straighter. When he spoke, his voice was calm, even, but laced with the kind of authority that didn't need to be raised to be heard. Your Honor, while I understand my name being dragged into this, I'd like to clarify a few points. He turned, facing Ryan's team directly. They did not intimidate him. The intimate photograph in question, Nate continued, was taken without our knowledge, during a 6-hour flight where Ms. Turner, exhausted from working multiple shifts to support her daughter, fell asleep. The idea that this innocent moment is being twisted into something sordid is, frankly, insulting. Grace held her breath. He turned back to the judge. Furthermore, the claim that Ms. Turner is financially irresponsible is objectively false. She has lived within her means for years, prioritizing her daughter's well-being above all else. If anything, Her ability to maintain stability on a single income speaks to her dedication as a mother, not a failure. The judge nodded slightly, listening intently. Nate wasn't done. He reached into the folder before him, sliding a document toward the court clerk. We've also obtained bank statements that prove Mr. Carter has been withholding financial support beyond the legally required amount, despite his claims of wanting what's best for his daughter. Ryan's jaw tightened. He hadn't expected that. Grace's heartbeat kicked up. Nate had done his homework. The judge skimmed the document, then turned to Ryan. Mr. Carter, would you like to explain this? Ryan's attorney leaned down, whispering something, but Ryan's expression cracked. Just for a second. Grace felt a shift in the room. Then, just when she thought it couldn't turn further, the courtroom doors opened. Every head turned. Mrs. Louise. Aunt Carol guided her forward, the elderly woman walking with slow determination, despite the frailty in her frame. The judge looked up. Ms. Turner, are you here to provide testimony? I am. Ryan actually looked nervous. The clerk swore her in, and then she turned toward the judge, her voice quiet but firm. My granddaughter, Grace, is the best mother I have ever known. Silence. Louise folded her hands in her lap. She has sacrificed everything for Lily, not because she had to, because she wanted to. Her gaze cut to Ryan. Mr. Carter may have money, but he does not have her heart. Grace's throat thickened with emotion. Louise turned back to the judge. If you take Lily from her mother, you will not be giving her a better life. You will be taking away the best thing she has. The judge studied Louise for a long moment before nodding. Ryan's lawyer stood hastily, clearing his throat. Your Honor, while we respect Ms. Turner's perspective, we maintain that... The judge raised a hand. That's enough. A heavy pause. Then she looked at Ryan, unimpressed. You're not making a compelling case, Mr. Carter. She sighed, removing her glasses. I am not prepared to make any changes to the current custody arrangement at this time. The words hit like a gavel. Ryan stiffened. His lawyer murmured something, but the damage was done. Grace exhaled sharply. She had won. The judge glanced at her. Ms. Turner, I'd advise staying out of the public eye while this case remains open. But beyond that, keep doing what you're doing. The case was dismissed. The courtroom erupted in murmurs as people began gathering their things. Ryan stormed out, his jaw tight, his shoulders rigid. Grace barely had time to process before Nate turned to her. You did it. Her breath hitched. We did it. For a moment, they just stood there. Then she did something reckless. She stepped forward, just a breath, and wrapped her arms around him. Nate stilled. Then slowly, deliberately, his arms came around her. She let herself breathe. For the first time in a long time, she felt safe. The hospital room was quiet except for the steady beep of the heart monitor and the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. Grace sat beside her grandmother's bed, fingers absent-mindedly tracing patterns on the edge of the blanket. The weight of the courtroom, the fight, the fear of losing Lily still clung to her. But now, finally, it was over. She had won. And yet her mind wasn't on Ryan or even the custody battle. It was on Nate. She hadn't seen him since they walked out of the courthouse, since she threw herself into his arms without thinking, without hesitating. He had held her, steady and warm, without expectation, without asking for anything in return. And now she was left with a different kind of uncertainty, the kind that came when a man who had no reason to stay kept showing up anyway. The door creaked open. She turned, heart stuttering, when she saw him standing there, holding a bouquet of flowers so large it almost looked ridiculous in his hands. Nate Calloway, billionaire, untouchable finance mogul, a man who could have been anywhere in the world, was here. His eyes locked on hers, something in them unreadable, something that made her breath catch. I figured, he said, stepping inside, after the day we had, you deserve something nice. Grace stared at the bouquet, then back at him. A warmth bloomed in her chest, slow and terrifying. You bought me flowers? She asked, her voice softer than she meant it to be. His lips quirked. I wasn't sure what kind you liked, so I got all of them. Her throat tightened. Who does that? Before she could speak, a raspy voice interrupted. Well, it's about time. They both turned. Louise, despite looking far too frail for her usual antics, managed a smirk as she eyed Nate. "You're the one she fell asleep on, aren't you?" A laugh rumbled from his chest. "I suppose I am." Louise turned to Grace, looking far too pleased. "Well, what are you waiting for?" Grace sputtered. "Grandma." "Oh, hush," Louise cut in. "If you don't say yes to this man, I will get out of this bed and drag you to him myself." Nate chuckled, but Grace could feel his gaze on her, waiting. The air between them shifted, tilted into something heavier, something neither of them could ignore. "I don't know where this goes," he said finally, voice lower now, steadier. "I don't have a plan, and I don't have a timeline, but I do know that I want to see where this leads. If you do too." Her stomach dipped, because this wasn't a grand declaration or some impulsive promise. It was a choice he was offering her. She met his gaze, steady and sure, and for the first time in so long, she let herself wonder. What if she said yes? Los Angeles stretched out before them, golden and endless, the city lights flickering like distant stars as the car moved through the streets. The windows were down, the night air rushing in, tangling through her hair. For the first time in what felt like forever, Grace let herself breathe. Nate sat beside her in the driver's seat, one hand on the wheel, the other resting absent-mindedly between them, close enough that if she moved just slightly, their fingers would brush. The silence between them was comfortable. It felt dangerous. How easy it was to sit here with him, to feel like this wasn't insane, like this wasn't impossible. Finally, he glanced over at her. "Penny for your thoughts?" She exhaled a quiet laugh, shaking her head. "Just trying to wrap my head around everything." He hummed, thoughtful. "It's been a hell of a week." She turned to him, studying the sharp lines of his profile, the way the city lights reflected in his eyes. "Why did you help me?" she asked. He didn't hesitate. "Because you deserve someone in your corner." A lump formed in her throat. "Because I wanted to," he added, softer now. Something inside her cracked, fractured open in a way she hadn't expected. This man, this impossible, infuriating man, had done more for her in a matter of days than Ryan had in years. Grace looked away, staring out at the city. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. Nate's fingers twitched against the gear shift. "Do what?" "Let someone in." The words hung between them, bare, exposed. He didn't push, didn't demand more from her than she was ready to give. He just nodded, as if he understood. "Then let's figure it out together." Her chest tightened, because for the first time in years she wanted to. She wanted to try. The road stretched ahead, endless and unknown, but this time she wasn't driving alone. Life often pushes single mothers to their limits, forcing them to juggle financial burdens, emotional resilience, and the constant worry of providing stability for their children. Like Sarah, many single moms work tirelessly, sacrificing sleep, personal time, and even their own dreams just to keep life afloat. The fear of not being enough, of not having enough, is a silent battle they fight every day. Sarah's story is a reminder that asking for help isn't weakness, it's survival. Her aunt's generosity gave her the chance to be where she was needed most. In real life, single mothers often hesitate to lean on others, feeling they must carry everything alone. But strength isn't just endurance, it's knowing when to accept support. Another lesson from Sarah's journey is that life-changing moments often come unexpectedly. Taking a chance, stepping outside of fear, can open doors we never imagined. Whether it's a career opportunity, a new relationship, or simply prioritizing self-care, single moms must allow themselves moments of possibility. To every single mother struggling today, you are enough. Your sacrifices don't go unnoticed. Keep pushing forward, but don't be afraid to let life surprise you. Sometimes in the middle of exhaustion, the unexpected can change everything. Every story is a miracle.
I hope you enjoyed this thrilling journey. On a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate this story? Let me know in the comments below. Your feedback inspires more epic tales.